It's good to see you. It's great, and it's great to be together. We're moving, we're pivoting series, and I've just been loving where we've been for these last few weeks and months, going back through the Psalms, which I just found a joy, and spending 3 weeks in Esther on the providence of God and the faithfulness of God and the promises of God. We're going to pivot into the life of Moses, and really this morning I'm barely going to talk about Moses, to be honest with you. Because if you want to understand the life of Moses, the worst place to start is with Moses. And I'm going to try and explain to you why I think that's the case. And in order to do that, I'm going to let you in on a secret of how hard I have to try to be normal in the presence of other people. It's incredibly difficult for me. And I'm going to let you in to the sort of secrets of my inner monologue that I have to manage when I'm talking with other people. My friend and I, Mark, when we were young, he had a problem of sort of attracting attention, and I had a problem of making things worse. So Mark has just something about him where he would go into a classroom and a teacher would just take instant dislike to him, where he'd have a shirt untucked by this amount, and the teacher would say, "Mark, get out." And he'd say, "Why?" And she'd say things like, "Well, now you're talking back, so get out." Okay? So he would just... So we encountered on the street, because of Mark's face, what we would encounter on the street, what I would have said, was unprovoked aggression. And I have the problem, which I'm going to let you into, of always making things worse. Because in my mind, there's these two voices in a conversation, and this one is a hyper pedant. Okay? And this one is socially acceptable, and this one almost always wins. So we'd be in a situation, and Mark would, so this is the sort of thing that happens in my mind. I'll be talking to someone, and I'll say, this voice will say to me things like, they need to know. And this voice will say, no, you just leave it. You just leave it. They don't need to know. Just leave it. And okay, so you were telling me that you had a situation, and you were facing a couple of options, so that you're in a quandary. I think it would be better to describe that as a dilemma. So you're not gonna help me? So well, just leave it. No one. Come on, mate. No one. Don't be so pedantic. Particular. Yeah. So just leave it. Come on, mate. No one likes a pedant. It's not technically true that no one likes a pedant. Right. If you don't stop, you're gonna go home in an ambulance. Ambulances don't take you home. Okay. So if you're like me, you're probably going to love what I'm about to describe next, and if you're not, you're just going to have to bear with it. Look, I don't know if you've ever read Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. It's a bit of a classic, and it's a classic because it's got some classical myths around it. And so now, culturally, it's also classic, whether you've read it or not, to be able to undermine the myth about it. So, for example, the myth about it, if you've never read Frankenstein, you might think Frankenstein is the monster. But if you've read Frankenstein, you know that Frankenstein is the name of the doctor and not the name of the monster. But if you've understood Frankenstein, you know that the doctor makes something he doesn't look after, which means Dr. Frankenstein is the monster. Oh, so now, right, if you're the sort of person where this voice always wins, that's a freebie for you at parties. Well, what's that got to do with the life of Moses? Nothing. Let's move on. It does, because there's a profound difference between hearing the myth and thinking who's the monster in the story, and reading it, coming to a different opinion, but deeply understanding it changes your opinion once again. And when it comes to reading the Pentateuch, we will expect, because of the way that we read novels, that these arbitrary splits of chapters will be discrete units that mean something. But they're not really, because every unit's meaning finds its meaning in the meaning of the whole. And if you don't read the whole and you don't understand the plot, then things are going to look very weird to you. And you'll start thinking heroes are monsters and monsters are heroes, because who's doing what is driven by this wider plot of what's being restored and what's getting rescued and what's it's going to cost, and how someone's response is in the way of what someone else is doing. And sometimes on the surface it looks like these vast, enormous responses to minor infractions, but they're not really when you understand the plot. And if you don't understand the plot, you start calling people monsters that aren't really. And so look, we're going to develop this morning really, really important. There's a sniff test that I'm going to provide for you for heresies in the history of the church, and they're almost always this. They drive a wedge between the Father and the Son by driving a wedge between creation and redemption. The sniff test for heresies in the history of the church, always that go back to the Trinity, is that if you want to drive a wedge between God as creator and God as redeemer, then you just mischaracterize the Trinity so you can drive a wedge between the Father and the Son. Because creation and redemption are two sides of the same coin. In fact, it's the entering of something into the world that drives God going for the same aim that he always had in creation. Redemption is a restoration project, fueled. So you can't just ruin a story by misreading it. You can ruin a story by misrepresenting it. One of the best reviews I've ever seen of the book Sense and Sensibility was someone who said, describe it in a tweet, and the answer was, rich people having dinner at other people's houses. That's Sense and Sensibility. And so I thought, okay, look, I'm going to have a go myself at summarizing some plots for you from classic literature, because I just thought it would be helpful. Here's one. This is Of Mice and Men. Some of these I found, some of these I wrote, and I can't remember which ones. So if you laugh, I'll say it was me. Of Mice and Men, this is it. A man shoots his best friend after promising to buy him a rabbit. That's Of Mice and Men. Harry Potter. A young boy runs into a wall and starts believing he's a wizard. That's true. That's technically true. Here's a review of The Wizard of Oz. This is a real one that was found. This was in a newspaper. A girl moves house, kills the first person she meets, robs the body, and teams up with 3 other people to kill again. That's technically true. She does do that. What you can do in a story, if you've misread it, you can also misrepresent it, because you elevate certain details of what happens and you minimize other very important details of what happens, so that you start thinking that monsters are heroes and heroes are monsters. I mean, if you did that with Lord of the Rings, you might be able to say, a small man refuses to return a piece of stolen jewelry and throws it in a fire. Well, it's technically true, isn't it? It doesn't belong to him, it's somebody else's. And yet there are details about what's happening that transform his actions into something heroic. Because when you understand what's at stake, and when you understand the evil he's getting in the way of, when you understand what he's fighting for, and when you understand what it costs him, Frodo doesn't look like a monster, he looks like a hero. All right. The reason I'm telling you all of this is because the life of Moses, it isn't about sheep and bushes and seas and laws and circumcision. Not really. There are moments in the story, and they move the story on. They've got meaning, and they're symbolic, and they've got value, and they point to things, but they only make sense within a bigger story. You see, at its heart, the story of the life of Moses is about someone who is willing to say yes to grace and to God's promise and to blessing and to what God is going to do in the nations and what God is going to do in his people, and how this plot line, which is the plot line of the Exodus, and it's the plot line of the Pentateuch, and it's the plot line of the Old Testament, because it's the plot line of everything, of how people will return to the presence of God in the house of God. That's the story of the life of Moses, and of a person who says, a very broken, very imperfect person, who sets off on one moment trying to bring about that story in their own strength and needs humbling for 40 years to rely on doing it through God's. But it's about a person who will say yes to that plot line, to that promise, grace, to God returning people to his presence. The only place to start with the life of Moses is Genesis 1. So I'm going to start in Exodus 1, and we're going to go there. And I'm going to show you why. This is Exodus 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob. That doesn't feel like the start of a book, does it? Because it's not. That division is arbitrary, really, because this is just the continuation of the end of Genesis, where Joseph's gone into Egypt and his brothers have gone into Egypt, and they've gone in as a family and they come out as a nation. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went into Egypt with Jacob, each with his family: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt, and now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly. They increased in numbers and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, he came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they'll become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites and worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. So the beginning of Exodus points to a bigger story in Genesis. And the story of Joseph in Genesis really only makes sense in the story of Abraham. And the story of Abraham really only makes sense in the story of Noah. And the story of Noah really only makes sense in the beginning. In the beginning, God does a thing. And I'm going to try and show to you that it matters because of that. What I want to show to you is that the life of Moses takes its roots all the way back to what God is doing in creation. The story of redemption takes its roots all the way back to what God is doing in creation. All the covenants go there. Every single one of the covenants go there. And there's a hook and a link that I want to show you. Because, okay, let's go back to Genesis 1. And we're not going to spend... We might spend ages here, to be honest, actually, thinking about it. I was going to say we're not going to spend long here, but I can't ever really promise you that we're going to not spend long anywhere. In the beginning, God. And here we got this account, which again, look, if you read it cheaply, you're going to use it as a manual. If you're going to read it deeply, you're going to realize that it's the distinctions that matter. Because as creation stories go, this one isn't that different from a whole load of other ones you'd have found in the culture at the same time. And people would say, well, it's poetry. And I know what they mean because it's very poetic, but the truth is it's actually just heavily stylized, which means it is telling you something. It's intentionally written, but it's intentionally written in a way that draws some things out. So the things that are distinctions from the stories around it are the things that really tell you the essence of what it's getting at. And let me tell you, there's one thing that is vastly different. It is not in the beginning God's. And that's the difference to the culture around it, number one. Because that transforms the story that you think you're living in. If your creation story, like many at the time, said what really happened was there was a fight where the strong one won out, then creation exists to display the strength of somebody. But where in the beginning it's God, who lacks nothing and who needs nothing, then we can't be here to fulfill a lack in him. We can't be here because he needs something. We can't increase his glory because it's maximal. We can't do anything that he doesn't already have. We can't give him anything that he already lacks. And so let me say, it means that God doesn't make out of a need in himself. God has no point to prove in creation, and that means that the motive behind it must be this: the grace of sharing himself with that he was going to make. Why is there not nothing? Because God graciously wants to share himself with something. The distinctives really matter. And so then you end up with this sequence. Day 1, 2, 3, God makes a thing. Day 4, 5, 6, God fills that thing. Massively stylized and massively structured. Day 1, 2, 3, he makes these 3 different domains. Days 4, 5, and 6, he fills them. He speaks to make a thing, and he speaks to fill it. Forming, filling, abundance. That's what he does. Grace. And that one day stands out. You see, day 6 reaches a peak where you get the only thing that's actually poetry, male and female, he created them. Image bearers that turn this good thing into a very good thing in Genesis 1. And then you hit day 7, which is blessed, and it's holy, and it's set apart, and it's different. Why? See, John Lennox, who's a maths professor, he likes a good sequence because, he's a maths professor. He said, the one thing I've learned about sequences as a maths professor, they invite you to ask where they're heading. Because as soon as we detect a sequence, we want to ask where it's going. Day 1, 2, 3, he makes a thing. Day 4, 5, 6, he fills it. And it crescendos with image bearers who are righteous. And day 7, they have communion with him. Why is there not nothing? So that image bearers can enjoy the presence of God in the house of God. That is what it is for. That is what we are for. That is what we are made to enjoy. And so the disaster of sin entering the world, this disaster of alienation, means the creation project could be done. It could be over. Because when humanity leaves the presence of God and leaves the garden, what is God going to do? Is he going to end it, or is he going to put that right? Both options are freely available to a God that didn't need us in the first place. And yet it's always grace. And so here we go. We get us in the garden, and what does God say to us? Be fruitful and multiply. Enjoy my presence and extend it everywhere. That's the mandate. Enjoy the presence and extend Eden everywhere. But when the fracture hits, it's like a crack in the windshield. And if you've ever left one, no one would ever be silly enough to leave one, would they? I can tell you what I've seen happens on the photos. It spreads. Because sin enters the world with a capital S, which wants an alienation from God. And so we were meant to extend Eden everywhere. Righteous image bearers enjoying the presence of God in the house of God, which was the whole creation. And now, all we do is fuel the fracture. We just extend the brokenness everywhere. We just fuel the fire which consumes image bearers, because it always has done and always will do. And so what's God going to do? What is God going to do? Well, here's an option. He could do something with a guy called Noah. What if you picked the most righteous one of those people you could find? What if you got the best one? Because the fracture fuels quickly, and the brokenness extends everywhere, and before we know it, people have completely forgotten about who God is. They don't know him. They've completely forgotten that they're for his presence because they're not enjoying him. And there's one guy, righteous Noah. We love a bit of righteous Noah. We could do something with this guy. There's material that we can work with in righteous Noah. And so we're not going to get into it because, it's a theological geek out, and I'm not really allowed to do that on a Sunday morning. But what you get is you get a mini creation persisting through a decreation. Because in the creation, God separates the waters. In the flood, what does he do? He lets them both go. There's the chaos comes back, and what persists through it? 3 levels. Just a bit like the creation in the beginning. These 3 domains, and God fills it, and it persists through a decreation. And what comes out the other side? The most righteous human that you're going to find. And what happens? He fuels the fracture. So I tell you what the answer's not going to be. It's not going to be found in us. You can take the most righteous person you can find, but you could decreate the whole world, And if the one thing that survived on the other side of it was the best human heart you could find, the fundamental lostness of our hearts means we're always going to fuel the fracture. If Eden's coming back, if people are going to enjoy the presence of God, if people are going to know him, it's not going to be through a righteous man, kind of. It's going to be by grace, because God calls a guy called Abraham, and he makes him righteous by faith. By the way, when Noah comes out of the ark, do you know what God says to him in his covenant? Be fruitful and multiply. Because the covenant was always about creation. Because every covenant is about knowing God and returning to enjoying his presence. Enjoying the presence of God in the house of God is what it's all about. He calls a guy called Abraham, and he makes him righteous by a promise. He promises him a whole things. We clearly are not going to have any time to do that. He promises him a great name, but what he promises is that he will be fruitful and he'll multiply. His descendants are going to be formed by blessing to be a blessing. And you know what the blessing's going to be, don't you? People enjoying the presence of God in the house of God. Righteous image bearers are going to extend Eden everywhere. We just don't yet know how it's going to happen, but it's got something to do with grace. It's got something to do with someone believing God. It gets credited to them as righteousness. It's not going to be about works, because even if the best human heart persists through the flood, all it's going to do is fuel the fracture. So it's going to have to be about grace. God's going to have to provide the means for it. He says to Abraham, I've called you. I'll be your shield and your very great reward. There's a promise. And through you, every clan in the world is going to get blessed. Be fruitful and multiply. I want you to see something in Exodus 1 that we read. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all when they went in. Verse 7. The Israelites were exceedingly fruitful, and they multiplied greatly. There's about to be a clash in the beginning of Exodus. That is not incidental. They are fruitful and they multiplied. Because grace is being outworked. Because even when you can't see it, and this is going to be a mess of grammar, God is always gospeling. Which if we fuel the fracture, God extends Eden everywhere, and it's what he does. And the people of the promise go into another land that they were told they were going to be in for 400 years. And in there, the promise is at work all the time. They are fruitful and they multiplied. They couldn't help it because it's a work of grace. There is a people that God is going to use so that people come to know and enjoy the presence of God in the house of God. That's what it's always been about. And so there's cool things and cool features that I geek out about. And at their worst, you can spot the patterns and think it's a bit like spotting patterns in a carpet. Like spotting types of Christ in the Old Testament. He's like, what am I going to do with that? It's just like spotting patterns in a carpet. It's interesting. Because this means we have been grafted into this story. This is our story. When Paul says in 1 Corinthians to a group of Gentile Christians, this was written for us and our instruction, that's as true for us as it was for them. There is something here about learning what it means to know God and enjoy his presence forever that we're going to find in the life of Moses. This story is a moment in our story. It changes everything, because if that's the big plot in which it's making sense, then what God does isn't random acts where we sort of have to guess why God would do it, and then it finds its logic, its coherence in a bigger plot line that God is working out in history. So when he says, and it's going to make more and more sense as we go through it, but why do the people get set free? Well, because they're oppressed and because God hears their cry. Yeah, but why do they get set free? And this is what God's going to say in Exodus 6. Let my people go, freedom, so that they can worship me. Purpose. I'm not bringing them out into the land for the land. I'm bringing them out into the land to enjoy my presence in the land. Which is why when a big disaster is going to hit the people and we're going to see it, Moses says, don't send us there if you're not going with us. What are we without your presence? We're the people of the promise. We're a people meant to extend Eden everywhere. We are a people who know you and enjoy you. If you're not with us, we are not a people. Yeah, you are. You're a nation. Yeah. But we're more than a nation. We're his people. Moses is going to get told to build a temple. And all the stuff in it is going to be like Genesis 1 all over again. Because you know what happens when Moses builds it? He saw it and he said it was good. Do you know what you get in the temple like you got in Eden? You get the light shining on 12 loaves of bread. That is the presence of God represented shining on the people. Do you know what you get? You get 2 cherubim looking out the east side of it, just like you did when you were back in Eden. Do you know what you get? You get language that when God's presence comes, he's going to walk to and fro in the tabernacle, just like he did in the garden in Genesis 3. It is full of Eden images. This is the question that this life of Moses is dealing with. How does humanity enjoy the presence of God in the house of God? Creation was just a big house for him. The temple's just a mini one in the middle of a broken world. It is all about the presence of God coming back to his people. And when you get that, some things become richer, like in John 1 when it says, the Word became flesh and he tabernacled amongst us. There is no break in creation and redemption. It's really important that we read the story and we get the story, or else we might do a Frankenstein thing. It's really important that we get the story and we understand that, you know, we like to use the phrase, God has always been like Jesus. Because Jesus is God, he's always been like Jesus. And the degree to which we end up uncomfortable with the actions of God in Exodus, and the degree to which we're uncomfortable with the actions of Jesus. And that works both ways. Because it means Jesus is more awesome and mighty and holy than I like to think. And yet, understand this, his heart has not changed one bit. So every action we see him do in the Exodus is leading to him giving his life on the cross. And there's no tension. If you were to ask Jesus, what do you think of what God did in Exodus? What I did in Exodus? And the distinctions matter. God in Christ would give himself. That someone like me, who on my best days feels the fracture, would enjoy and know the presence of God. Would be made able to enter a place where by the end of Exodus, the glory of God is going to fill a temple and Moses can't go in. Not until a sacrifice turns the house of God into a place of meeting. There you go. You get what Leviticus is about now. And all of that is a shadow, the substance of which is Jesus. The heart of God is that sinful people become righteous image bearers, extending Eden everywhere, not by our works, but by grace. Not by our way, but by the giving of himself. And by shed blood, which is not our offer to an angry God to appease him, but which is a gracious offer of a holy God to cleanse us. And we get to enjoy his presence, which is where it's going in an unmediated, see his face, enjoy him forever kind of way, and which we enjoy now as when Christ came, he came at the right time so that the promise of Abraham might come to the Gentiles so that we might receive the promised Holy Spirit by faith. When you get filled with the Holy Spirit, you're going all the way back to creation purpose, because creation and redemption are the same side of one coin, in which God is always gospeling, and in which his purpose, that people would know him and enjoy him forever, gets fulfilled in people like us. The life of Moses is a shepherd of a nation, and it's a big story that makes sense within a bigger story. It is why we are here in every sense, individually and corporately as a temple. Don't you know, says Paul, that you, plural, are a temple of the Holy Spirit? Why we gather to know him and enjoy him. I'm like, Captain Missional. Be with Jesus, become like Jesus. Yeah, fine. Leave those. Do the things he did. Come on, let's go do stuff. No. Yeah, we do the stuff. Know him. And do you know how you know him? This is what God's going to tell us throughout the Exodus in every way. I am the God who. There is something about the way that he rescues which tells you exactly who he is. There's something in the way that he saves you and frees you that tells you exactly who he is. We don't sing about the cross all the time just because it did something, although we do, but because that's how we know him. Like, it's how we come to know him, and it's the means that we enter, but it's also how we know him. He's the type of God who would give his one and only Son that we might live through him. Like, love's been manifest. Love is at the heart of the character of God and the heart of the Christian faith. And the doubt about it's been removed because of the cross. And we know him. And that's the bedrock of the story of the life of Moses. And here's a question. Are you enjoying what you got saved for? Not are you thankful for what you got saved from, which is a good question. But to what degree are you enjoying what you got saved for? The presence of God in the house of God. Can we stand?